I'm going to start singing. I'm Kyle Cleveland, the Associate Director of Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies that produces this lecture series. And I feel very happy to have Stephen Murphy-Shigematsu with us this evening. Many of you may know him, but Stephen taught here at TUJ when I first came in the early 90s. And somehow TUJ was not able to hold on to him as he escaped to Stanford, of all places. And in the interim, he was at Tokyo University as a psychology professor, and also now at Stanford has started a very interesting new institute and project dealing with Asian studies and also comparative race and ethnicity. Stephen has done a lot of work on multi-ethnicity, people of half or doubles, wherever you want to conceive them. There's an interesting documentary film by the filmmaker Reggie Life. Some of you may have seen his film, The Taylor Anderson Story, which screened here last year, about the tsunami. This is a film that was done probably around the late 80s, early 90s. And in that film, which we happen to have in our library, one of the vignettes is a focus on Stephen's family and his life history, growing up himself as a person of mixed heritage. He's published both in Japanese and English. He has a very broad range of work and materials. And as a person who teaches some courses in race and ethnicity, I kind of sit in awe of Stephen's work. I've used it in my classes, and I consider him to be really one of the more insightful people dealing with these issues, with also a great deal of psychological insight, emotional insight to what how these issues resonate with people and their lived experience. So Stephen will speak about this today, and we also have available for 3,000 yen this book called When Half is Whole. It's over here. I'll pass it around if you want to take a look, and I hope we can encourage you to buy that. So Stephen will talk, and then we should have time for an extended Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Stephen Murphy-Shigematsu.
Well, thank you, Kyle. As Kyle mentioned, I used to teach here many years ago. So it's a kind of homecoming for me to be here. It's funny how when you look back on your life, some of the things that you had not really hoped for turned out to be the best things. So I had never thought I wanted to work here. And after this I worked at far more famous, prestigious places. But I think I was never as happy as I was here. And it was a very exciting for my first job teaching, and I was able to do half of my time teaching and half my time counseling, and so I was really introduced to a whole amazing group of students, many of coming from backgrounds that I had never encountered before, and it became the stimulation for me to write the book, really, and it started quite a while ago, but I was working with students who would come, they would be in my classes, and then they would also come to me for counseling. So it was quite a combination, but I really got to know a lot of students intimately that way by them coming in, sharing the kinds of struggles they were going through as adolescents, who were often had experienced American education and felt something very attractive in that. And wanted to somehow get that in Japan, and many of my students transferred eventually to universities in the States. But for me, it was a very exciting time. It's kind of it's a homecoming for me to be back here, actually, and surprised to see some people who were here then, and surprised that they're still alive. I guess just kidding. They look great. But I'm especially thankful. Kyle has been the person who has kept me connected, and it's been sporadic. But when we do connect, it's enabled me to come back and to be here. So I'm really grateful to the work Kyle's doing. Rather than talk directly about the book, what I would like to do is to talk about, to tell a story that puts the making of the book into the context of my life. So to show how some of you who are scholars might know this very well, but the work that we do is often very intimately connected with our lives, and who we are as people, and how who we are determines the things that we study. And in my case, it's very obvious, and so I want to tell a story that shows you how my life has led to research, certain kind of research, and how that led to the producing or the writing of this book. So I'm going to show you some, tell the story by showing you some pictures, and starting with this one here. So this is me at 17, and I was kind of a strange lad, I guess, who trying to understand who I was. And at my high school, there weren't that many kids, and they said you can have your high school photo any way you want. And so this is my choice of how I got out my yukata and tied the waistband around my head as a hachimaki, and then they built a roaring fire behind me, and I guess I was probably imagining myself, as some type of a fierce samurai warrior or something, and about to go out to battle. Although if I had stood up, my kimono would have fallen off because I had the waist. This was up on my head. But at this point, I was trying to understand, I think, who I was, and who I was in the sense of becoming a person. How did I fit into the human family? And what I had to go by was knowledge of first of all, who my parents were. And my parents were two people who had met in Tokyo after the war, and they were working in the same office building down in the GHQ building. By some miracle, my mother was hired as an interpreter. And I said, how could you have been an interpreter when you didn't speak English? She said, well, nobody spoke English. So I just walked in and said I spoke English, and I said a few words, and somehow they hired me. So I think that she was kind of overlooked, as girls often were, during the war, and she was actually learning English. And so she had better English than most Japanese, and was able to work in the GHQ, where she met my father, who was also working there.
Because she is very good.
My mommy?
Yeah.
She just mommed me. And I didn't really know much about my family. I knew that there was a family that had come from Ehime, and that had this one photo of my mother as the baby in the middle, and she's sitting on the lap of her mother, my grandmother, and this is my grandfather, neither of whom I ever met. They both died before I was born. And just to further complicate it a little bit, but it's necessary for the explanation, my mother was adopted by her older sister, Mitsu. And she was adopted, and she married this guy, Kataoka. And then they adopted my mother and took my mother to Tokyo. So he became a policeman in Tokyo, and my mother ended up at 4 years old coming to live with them in Suginami-ku, in the Izumi area of Suginami-ku. But I really didn't know much about this family. I knew that they were gathered here for the funeral that was about to occur for my great-grandfather, who they told me was a hatamoto, meaning a samurai who was in direct service to the shogun. But the name he had was actually, at this point, Shigematsu. And the story was that he had fled the battle around Ueno. His older brother had been killed, and he fled on a fishing boat after they were defeated, and went to Matsuyama, where there were friendly samurai. And there he changed the name from Yamamoto to Shigematsu because he wanted to hide his identity in case they followed him and tried to kill him. So this was, the family name became Shigematsu, which actually has no ancestral connections at all, but this was, this is the little I knew of the family. Most of these people are dead now, except for my aunts, who are all still alive and living in Tokyo, and they're all, my Obachan always called them like Shizu-chan and Tami-chan, and they're like in their 90s, all of them now. So this is quite an old photo, but I knew this about my family, and I also knew that I had another family, and this was the Murphy family who had immigrated from Ireland near the end of the 19th century, and with their roots in southwest Ireland. And it was a family that they had very few children. For some reason, you had to have one person had to become a priest, and then the rest, for some reason, didn't marry early or just never had children. But they were also had what seemed to be a colonized mentality, right? And even though they were white Europeans, they had been colonized, and their immigration and their psychology was always complicated by that colonized background. I also knew that my parents had a hard time actually getting married, and so when my father asked my grandmother, she said that he wants to marry, but that my grandfather had been to the Suginami Kuyakusho, and they said, we can't marry them because he's an American. So go down to the American embassy. So my father went to the American embassy, and they said, well, you can't get married because you can't take her to the States anyway, because Japanese can't go to the US. And so then in the subsequent years, there were periods in which marriage was possible for short periods, but you had to get all the paperwork in, and you had to actually go to the US within a short period of time. And so there were several hundred marriages. My parents weren't one of them, but people who had good connections, especially in the military, and could get lots of letters. There were hundreds of people who were able to marry, but my parents couldn't. But my grandmother said that my father could move in anyway, because he was clearly a man who respected my mother and respected Japanese people, and that she didn't care that he was American. It didn't matter to her, and I think she was far ahead of her times as somebody who had an open heart and didn't see that kind of differences between people. So my dad moved in, and then my two sisters were born, 49 and 1950. And they're both born as Japanese with the name Shigematsu, because my parents' marriage was not legalized. So they're legally shiseiji, right? They're illegitimate children. And the nationality law, which is patrilineal, allowed children who were born to unmarried couples to be Japanese. But by the time I'm born in 52, the marriage is legalized, and so I'm born as an American named Murphy. So the kids, we had different nationalities and different names at the time that were at that early age. And I also knew that my father had become gradually darker, drinking heavier, and seemed to really not feel like he was fitting in Japan, and wanted to go back to the US and wanted to show his children to his parents, but both his parents had died by that time. But he said he still wanted to show the kids to his remaining family, his brothers and sisters. And so he convinced my mother that we would live in Southern California, but he had to stop in Massachusetts first. So we stopped in Massachusetts, and poor Mom is still in Massachusetts. So she never did get out of Massachusetts to her dream of Southern California. But I knew that then that they had decided to leave. Especially, it was something that was very common, certainly for the couples, the American-Japanese couples. And by that time, my grandfather, who had been really reluctant to approve the marriage, and it's true for some grandparents who are opposed to what they call intermarriages of different kinds, they often come around when the grandchildren are born. And my grandfather, too, who was a former cop, came around when the kids were born, especially when I was born. And so I think this is a rare photo of that post-war period of an elderly Japanese man holding a so-called konketsu baby. At that time, they were still calling us ainoko, and then sometimes konketsuji. But when we left in a way that at that time was very dramatic. It wasn't going to Narita or Haneda and getting on a plane and 10 hours later you're in the United States. This was a huge trip, and it was going to Yokohama and getting a ship. And it meant the farewell to my grandparents, and It was something that was really devastating for my grandmother because she had never given birth to children, and she adopted my mother. But when we were born, we were all born in her house, so she suddenly had 3 babies. And she would tell stories of how she'd have Jo-chan on this side and In-chan on this side, and I was the baby, and I'd sleep right on her chest. And she was full of these warm stories of what it had been like to have these babies who had all at once were taken from her. And so she begged that one of them be left behind for her. And my parents said, well, which one could it be? You know, we can't leave the oldest one, and we can't leave our only son. We could probably leave the middle child, the poor, you know, it always happens to the middle child. I guess we could leave her, but she'd feel so bad that we left her. You know, she'd probably never recover from the shock. So in the end, all 3 of us went. And this is on the ship. And I look at it, I often wonder what my mother was feeling at that time. You know, this is a time when you left, you often didn't come back. And many of the war brides, what they called the war brides, the Senso Hanayome, they never came back. Because many of the families had told them, don't come back. If you marry to an American, don't come back. You're not part of the family. That was not the case for my mother, but in the end, we never had the money for her to come back for 20 years. And so it was a real separation at that time, a 2 weeks on the ship to California. My father, who was very emotional, is not in the picture anymore because he's already down at the bar and cannot stand to make the farewell. I think what he talked about later was the feeling of guilt of taking the kids away from my grandmother and taking the daughter away from my grandparents. And so that was the start of the journey to the States. And when we got there, I realized that there were images that people had of who we were that were based on the little they could understand about who these people were. This was in Massachusetts, where they had never seen Asians. And what they could go by were, there was a James Michener novel called Sayonara, published in '56. And then Hollywood came out with a movie not too long after that. And Marlon Brando was in there in red buttons. But the interesting thing about the 2 of them is that the ending is completely different. So when the novel comes out, Michener's ending is that Marlon Brando leaves the woman because he's told, you know, you're not going to get promoted as an officer unless you get rid of this Japanese woman. Your career is over. And so in the novel, he does what everybody else was doing at the time, and he basically throws away the woman and goes back to Texas and marries a Texas girl, and he saves his career. But the Hollywood ending is that Brando says sayonara, right? And he says, I don't care, you know, I'm not going to leave the woman I love, and so it goes, there's a nice happy romantic ending to the, but I realized that there was still also this idea that there was a war bride, and that war brides were women who had somehow captured an American man, often through their bodies, offering their bodies, and had captured American men who were offering them this wonderful, great life in the land of gold, where the streets were paved with gold. And so they were often, my mother felt that people treated her badly because they saw her as a war bride. We had a lot less trouble than my mother did, and because we came so early, all of us forgot how to speak Japanese. We really liked the size of the American hot dogs and the big clouds of pink cotton candy. And when Dunkin' Donuts came to town, we were just thrilled. And then there was McDonald's with the 15-cent hamburger, 10-cent French fries, 25 cents for a triple thick shake. So we were quite happy little people, except when they tried to put funny hats on us to make us look more Oriental they seemed to think we were more exotic than we did, because we were just becoming American kids. But we also realized that Americans did not know Japanese from Chinese, and that they needed things like Life magazine articles to tell them how to tell Japs from the Chinese. Now the reason they're Japs is because this is a time at which the US is at war with Japan, and therefore Japanese become Japs. But Chinese are our friends at this time, and therefore Chinese are Chinese. Now when things change, of course, politically, then the Japs become Japanese, and the Chinese become Chinks. So that's the American way. And this is the, if you look at history, it goes all the way through like that. But what we encountered was the simple fact that people didn't see the difference and didn't seem to care that there was a difference. So this article didn't seem to have much effect, where it did have a lot of helpful information that, like, Tojo Hideki had an earthly yellow complexion, whereas the Chinese guy has a parchment yellow complexion, which probably hard to tell when you're walking down the street and you're deciding whether to start a fight. There were these kinds of articles, and in a more serious way, there were really images of Japanese that were clearly remnants of the war, you know, and that many of, especially the Americans who had been traumatized by the war, were clearly still hostile to us, and we were a convenient, easy target as the one Japanese family in this whole that they'd ever seen, you know, since the end of the war. And so we felt that, you know, but in other ways we were also pretty unthreatening. You know, one family is not threatening to like a city's economy. You know, we weren't a big labor force threat in any sense. So in some sense, there were a lot of people who were just very friendly to us as well. But there was some sense in which I think as children, we really could feel this hostility that some people had. But I asked for a doggy, and I got it, because that's what really helped me to get through childhood, is the comfort of my dog. It didn't move or anything, but I talked to him, and he talked to me. And I had friends, and the friends were of different. They were all white, because everybody was white. But some of them were different, like the little guy Manny there, he's Italian. And so whenever there were fights, Manny was always on my side. So it's kind of like the Allies against the, what was the other group called? But the German kids never fought with us. They always, somehow, you can tell he's not holding my hand anymore. But Manny was always down all the way to the very end. And he wasn't much help because he was so little, but... and I always wondered why no one ever picked on Manny, though. And I thought, geez, I thought the war was with Italy, Germany, Japan. How come nobody ever, picks on Manny? And it really was the beginning of my education about race. It was extremely important. A racial difference was extremely important to people. And that there were other kids in the city, a lot of Italian kids and a lot of German kids, but I was the only one who was Japanese. And so that meant that was a big difference to people in terms of how they continued to feel the hostility from the wartime. So I think I felt a growing sense of isolation, difference, which extended as I got older into a feeling of isolation and alienation. And so I really wanted something different, and I really wanted to get out of this small town. And one day my opportunity appeared. So I heard about there was this thing called ABC, which was a scholarship program where any kid could go to these East Coast private boarding schools for free. So my parents said, okay, if you hate living here so badly, why don't you apply for a scholarship? And if you get one, you can leave home. So I got one. And I think my parents were really happy because they thought, wow, East Coast prep school for our son. I mean, my dad was a laborer. He worked in a factory when he could work. And so they thought, oh my God, we're going to rise up the social ladder. Arthur Schlesinger IV is probably going to be our kid's roommate, or maybe John Kennedy's grandson, who knows? And so we opened the door, and this guy is there, this guy here. He says, hey, my name's Rap Brown. And Rap Brown made me laugh because there was a guy, H. Rap Brown, of the Black Panthers. And I thought, oh, I knew really rap, and it turned out his name was Purcell Brown. But this was my roommate, and that became my whole beginning of a complete transformation, because my whole frame of reference about who I was now changed. My frame of reference until that point was only in that town where everybody was white. And suddenly I had a whole new group to see how I fit in or didn't fit in with other kids. And the black kids decided that I could be one of them, kind of an honorary black, because they said, well, you're not white. Why? Can't hear? But do other people bothered by the music? You can't hear it? Oh. Okay. It's kind of, I'm trying to create an atmosphere. So you'll have to gaman in a good Japanese way. I'll put it down a little bit. That part. I'm fooling with him because I know him from way back. So. But for me, it meant to be an honorary black was a way that it put me in a whole different way of seeing myself. Instead of, so I'd always had these friends who would basically, if I said anything about being Japanese, it was like, well, we don't care, you know, you're just our friend, right? But they also had no interest in it, and they had no way of really, you know, understanding it. And so it was not anything that I could share with anybody. And it was simply like, we like you, and therefore we'll kind of ignore the fact that you're Japanese. That's the way it felt to me anyway, you know. But that was the best they could do, because they just couldn't really imagine, I think, anything more than that. And it also gave me having black friends gave me a whole new vocabulary. It gave me a whole new way of seeing the kinds of experiences I had had, but had simply kind of pushed down and tried to get by, in the sense to, I'm going to steal your line, Roland, to stand out without sticking out. In other words, to be as good as I could be, but without sticking out to the point where I knew that some hostility would come to me. In other words, if I could be second, often I was the second, willing to be the second best player on every team. And that way, if I didn't threaten to want the leadership position, then it would not arouse any hostility. But if I wanted to be the top person, the one who really stuck out, then something would come to me. Hostility would come. And so I developed, this was, I think, a way I started to learn some new language and a new way to view the kinds of experiences that I had. And also, it was a way of being included simply for my body, what I could do with my body, which was something that especially was shared with the black kids, because it was something that the sport that we played also gave me some entry into a whole different kind of social acceptance that I'd never experienced before. But I came to the end of high school, and I realized, of course, that even though at the high school graduation the white kids had cleverly said that I was almost black, which shocked the hell out of my parents. But I also knew I wasn't black, and I felt like I certainly knew I wasn't Chinese. Even if somebody calls you a chink, that doesn't make you Chinese. And I didn't know that I assumed I wasn't white because kids had told me since I was little that I wasn't one of them. So I figured I must be Japanese. But of course, as soon as I came to Japan to celebrate my Japaneseness, what I was told was, you're not Japanese, you're American. And that was, of course, even true for my family. And to everyone in my family who welcomed me with, well, not open arms literally, you know, but when we came to Haneda, it was, konnichiwa, after not seeing them for 20 years. But it was certainly, there was no hugging and kissing at that time. But it was with certainly an open heart that I was welcomed. But it was also clearly told, not just there, but in everywhere I went in Japan, that I was American. And that was very clear to me. So I started, as I became more of going through different schools and becoming a scholar, I thought this was a good way that I could use my the research to find out who I was, which is something graduate students do. And so I thought, well, if I think about who my people could be probably people who are like me, people who are mixed race. Maybe that's who my real people are. And I came to Japan, and then in Tokyo, they said, we don't have any organizations that are for mixed people anymore. But we have, if you go to Okinawa, you can find organizations that are still serving mixed people. And especially they had the Pearl Buck Foundation was still in Okinawa at that time. So I went to Okinawa, and I started to collect people's stories. And I started to talk to a lot of people and hear their stories. But I couldn't understand them, because I couldn't understand Japanese. So I went back to my grandparents and I said, grandfather, Oji-chan, please teach me Japanese. And he said no, because he actually wasn't an educated man. And he said, I can't teach you, go ask your grandmother. My grandmother, fortunately, was a highly educated woman who, until she died at 113, was still raging against this goddamn fucking system that had prevented her from becoming a doctor. In other words, since she was a child, she had been told over and over again, you should have been born a boy, Mi-chan. If you had only been born a boy. And every time she tried to go beyond those limitations, she met the same wall over and over again. You should have been a boy. If you'd been a boy, oh, what would it be? What you would have become. So she tried to become a doctor. They said, no, you're a girl. Then she tried to she said, okay, if I can't be a doctor, I'll be a teacher. And she actually got her father to send her to teacher's school. And then one day the wicked aunt appeared at the school and said, well, I'm taking you home. We're taking you out of school. And she got home and she said, Father, why did you do that? And the father gave no explanation, but the aunt had convinced him that since her daughters didn't have education, that his daughter didn't need an education either. And so she was taken out of the school. And she lived to 113, and she told that story over and over and over again until the very end. I thought, well, maybe anger keeps people alive too. And she was not a peaceful woman. She had never been a peaceful woman, and she was amazing in the stories she told me. And that was the beginning of our relationship that lasted for. She was already 76 at that time, and she had a mastectomy, had lost one of her breasts. But she had an amazing energy and life power that I just, as a troubled adolescent, she gave me new life just to be with her. And our relationship continued until just a few years ago, when she was 100, we brought her to the United States and asked her where she wanted to spend her last years. I think I won't tell the story now, actually, but if we have time. Oh. All right. Yeah, I guess if I come this far, I have to tell the story. Right? Okay, so we take her to the United States. She's 100 years old, and we're thinking, where do you want to die? But she's thinking, where do you want to spend your last years? And my mother is the only child, and so she's adopted as the only child, and we're the only grandchildren. So I had this beautiful image of, Oba-chan will die, among in this great intimacy, surrounded by the people she loves the most. And so I thought it might be a happy ending. So we asked her, but then 4 months came, and then we said, you have to decide what to do. But my mother had told her, I'm 80 years old, I can't keep going back and forth. She had been going back and forth for about 15 years. 3 months with Oba-chan was all that she could possibly take, because they fought every day. So she said she never got her Japanese citizenship back, but so she used that as her excuse. 90 days, that's all they'll let me stay, is 90 days. I have to go back now. And then she'd go back and recuperate for a few months, and then come back to Japan 90 days later and do another 90-day stay. And that went on for years and years until my mother finally said, I can't do that anymore. And so we decided either stay in the States or when you come back to Japan, you have to live in a nursing home. So it was a really a major life decision. And my sisters, unfortunately, can't speak any Japanese anymore. And I was in Tokyo, and so my older sister calls me and says, ask Oba-chan what do you want to do? And so I get on the phone, and in Japanese I say, Oba-chan, どうする? もう決めないといけない。日本に帰るか、アメリカにこれから住むか決めないといけない。Oba-chan says, そうね、やっぱりお姉ちゃんのために帰った方がいいと思う。So I think I better go. For your sister's sake, it's better if I go back. And so I said, okay, give this phone to sister again. I tell my sister, she thinks she should go. For your sake, it's better if she goes back. And my sister says, no, that's not what I asked you. Tell her that I'm fine. I'll take care of her for the rest of her life. She can stay here. But ask her, what do you want to do? And I said, okay, I'll try. And I said, お姉ちゃんはね、別に気にしなくてもいいと言ってる。面倒見てあげるから。And, でも決めないといけない。日本に帰るか、アメリカに住むか。And she says, そうね、やっぱりあなたのママのために帰った方がいいと思う。Okay, so I go, she thinks it's better for mom if she goes back to Japan. And my sister says, no, that's not what I asked you. Tell her that don't worry about mom. Well, I'll take care of mom. And it was true, my mother was not really clear what she wanted. But tell her, I'll take care of mom, just what does you want to do? I said, okay, I'll try. And he said, おばあちゃん、別にママのことは無視して心配しなくてもいいから、あなた自身どうしたいんですか? アメリカに住みたいか、日本に帰るか、どっち? And so she said, そうね、やっぱりお姉ちゃんの旦那さんのために帰った方がいいと思う。So, okay, you think it's better for the husband. So she thinks it's better for Tom, that she says Tom loves her. Tom wants her to stay here. Just tell her that don't worry about what Tom wants. So I'll try again. おばあちゃん別に旦那さんのことを心配しなくてもいい、どうしたいの? So it goes on and on. It goes on for another 10 minutes. But so the moral of the story is, at the end I say to my sister, I don't think that Oba-chan can answer your question the way you want her to. And my sister says, yeah, okay. And so that was the end, and it was clear that she had decided to come back to Japan. And so she came back, and it really just changed my whole sense about what is love and caring, and how I think what I often feel in the United States is a much more individualistic sense of how you can express love. But that for a woman born in the Meiji era of Japan, to think that her individual desires could somehow be separated just didn't seem possible. And that what she wanted was what was best for all the people that she cared for. And she couldn't only think of it in that way. This was her at 110, but she's still going strong. And then eventually she developed, the circulation in her leg ceased, and she developed gangrene, and they asked us, what do you want to do? Do you want to amputate her leg? Probably go to the other leg. She'll probably have to have both legs amputated. Or, consider she's 111. The shock of the anesthesia might kill her. The shock of the surgery might kill her. Is it worth it? And the quality of her life had gone way down. She wasn't like this anymore. And so we decided that it would be best to simply let the disease run its course, and to let what happened eventually was, well, it didn't happen actually. I went there to see her because I needed to ask her what she wanted. And when I got there, she was still conscious, and I called her name, Oba-chan, and she opened her eyes and looked at me, and I knew she could tell that it was me, and I was there. When she closed her eyes, and within a few hours, she was rejecting food and rejecting water, and then they came and they said, what's that expression in Japanese? Yamaga kita. the Yama. It's time to, she's going to the mountain now. And so I stayed by her side, and then one moment, I think it often happens, I just went to the toilet for a moment. I thought I'm gonna leave just for a moment, and when I came back, it was dead silence. And I know that many people pass at that moment. That they appreciate, I think, that you're there and they're surrounded by their loved ones, but they also often don't die in front of you. It's just when you leave for a moment that is the moment they decide to let go, it seems. And so we had all the rituals, and they told me that she had waited for me to come as her only grandson. But it was the end of a whole. Actually, I didn't want to go into this story. I don't know how I got in here, but as a side story anyway about why. And this is, I guess, especially important to me, this moment in the sense of a homecoming, because it's the first time I've ever been in Japan without my grandmother. And by the strange set of circumstances, I'm a visiting professor at Meiji University for just a couple of weeks. In their guest house, when I went to the guest house, I got this eerie sense of something's really weird here. And I looked around, 2 blocks away is the house Ba-chan's house. So the house that I had lived in, the first house I had lived in, was right around the corner. So there's this very strange sense of coming home, and coming back to the origins of my life. But to go back to the other story, I went back to Okinawa, and I started to collect more stories of the people who were of mixed race. And some of them, actually these girls couldn't speak any English, but there were also some who could, but most of them couldn't. And as I stayed there longer, I also started to learn more about where I was, which was Okinawa. And it was clearly a place where understanding the lives of these kids of mixed race could not be done without understanding history and politics. So to understand the horrific Battle of Okinawa, which ended in June 1945, and to understand how that had traumatized an entire population, and how the existence of continuing existence of military bases, which cover 25% of the main island, are a constant reminder that it brings back memories, especially for elderly Okinawans, and that places the political struggle against the military bases is something that places the lives of what they are calling these days Amerasian or Amerasians in a particularly difficult situation. So what that means is that over the years, different political groups have used sometimes social service agencies' records and publicized cases of socially delinquent type kids, and kids who have been forced into prostitution, kids who have dropped out of schools, kids who are drug addicts. And they published whatever difficult stories they could because of their agenda of trying to say that because of the presence of the military bases, it creates this social problem, and that these kids are a living example of a social problem caused by the military bases, and therefore we have to get rid of the military bases. So it was a political cause that I had sympathy for, but I also realized that it was another story of how one minority group can persecute even people, subgroups within their minority group. And so it was clear that mainstream Okinawans were discriminating against the Amerasians, who said we're Okinawans too, but that they were being discriminated against by not just by classmates and schoolmates, but often even by teachers. So teachers who had this political agenda were often scapegoating kids even in their own classrooms. And so I started to put the stories I was hearing into a particular political, historical context, and knowing that they were still continuing, that when there was a highly publicized international rape of a young girl, the kids told me they were afraid to go to the political rallies because they were afraid that they would be violence against them, because they would be seen as the Americans. And so these kinds of political struggles, which are continually there and volatile, are something that the kids are always subjected to scapegoating. So I got a lot of stories, but what I was also told as I was leaving the last time was, you know, those stories are meant for you. So we like you because you're kind of like one of us. Not really, because you've had all those advantages that we never had. You know, you had a father who took you to America. You had an English education. You went to a college. And everybody knows it's a lot easier to be mixed in the United States than it is in Japan, especially in Okinawa. So you're not really one of us, but maybe you should be our leader. And so there was this really clearly mixed feeling about, you know, the recognition that I really wasn't one of them, but I was kind of like one of them, and I was certainly an advocate and an ally. And so maybe they saw I could be in a leadership position. But I left the islands, and I went back to college, where I was people were eagerly waiting for me to come back with my stories, because that's what you do when you're a graduate student. You do research, and you go somewhere, and if you're in anthropology or like psychology, as I was, and you get stories, and you come back and you publish them. But I had been told that, you know, what you're doing is just what everybody else has done to us too. You know, people have come, they've asked us to tell our stories, we've told them our stories, and we never see them again. And sometimes we hear they became famous or rich, or somehow they were able to benefit from getting our stories, but it's never done us any good. And in fact, it's done us a lot of harm. So please don't tell our stories, which is just the exact thing you don't want to be told when you're a scholar and you've just spent a couple of years of your life getting, or even more, to master Japanese, and then to go to do field work, participant observation, all the kinds of, and then the extended interviews and transcribing interviews, and then getting ready to publish them, remembering that I was told, please don't tell our stories. And I realized there was a whole different cultural sense about who owns a story. Because the publishers and the people in my university were saying, did they sign a form? And I say, well, yeah, because you told me to give them a form. They didn't know what they were signing, I don't think, but they signed something. They said, okay, that's it. You know, you're in America now. Everything in America is decided by a signature. You know, you've got a contract, you've got an interview release form. It's got a signature on it, and therefore we can publish their stories. You know. But I've been told by people that they didn't want me to publish their stories. And so I really had to kind of go way back into my past to think about what did I know about stories and storytelling. And I had grown up with a storytelling father who loved to drink and drank too much, but this drinking brought out the stories. And he needed a listener. Every storyteller needs a listener. And I was the last one by his side when my mother got tired of the stories pretty quickly. And then my older sister got tired of the stories. She'd disappear. And then my younger sister got tired of the stories. But I knew my dad needed a listener. And I don't know what he would do with it. I was afraid of what would happen to him if he didn't have someone to stay with him and listen to the stories. So I stayed. And I realized later, though, that I had actually learned something. That I was able to learn how to be a listener and how to listen to people's stories. And what a gift that was to people. To be able to receive a story. And what a gift it was to me. To be able to be the receiver, and what it was to offer somebody deep listening or true listening, which I feel like I got some understanding about when I looked at the older form of the kanji for kiku, right, to listen. That it's not something that's simply done with your ears by hearing words, but it's something that really demands the full use of all your senses. In this case, the eyes, and also a kind of undivided attention by the one. In some older forms, there's actually the O, the king, the kanji for king here, which is meant. I'm told that the king needed to be a great listener. A good king was a great listener because they needed to gather people who knew and would give the best information to the king. The king needed to listen to that and then make the best decisions. But it also, deep listening involves the heart, right? And that the heart-to-heart listening is what is truly the basis of real deep listening. And so I started to practice more as seeing the listening that I was doing in a clinical way. So I was working as a clinician, doing counseling, and starting to see that stories were also, that simple process of sharing stories was the most common form of healing being done every day in the world. Certainly in an informal sense, but also even in a formal sense for all the kinds of anonymous groups that exist. The Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the AA type groups that exist are simply storytelling places. People gather and everybody has a story, and everyone has the chance to tell a story, and there's no what they call crosstalk. You don't make comments on another story, you simply listen and receive the story, and then you have a chance to tell your story. And that's the most common form of healing circles that's done every day around the world, and certainly in a professional way also that can be offered to people. That simple process of responding to the need for people to tell stories and to listen to those stories. In Native traditions, there's also a deep appreciation of stories, that they're not just entertainment, but in a sense they're all we have. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Another Native writer who, First Nations writer in Canada, especially resonates with me because he was also somebody who wrote about his mixed identity and his identity search and how important it was for him. And later in life writing that these questions of identity no longer are an issue. But what's important are the stories that I've heard along the way, and the stories I've told. Stories we make up to try to set the world straight. Stories are medicine. A story told one way could cure, the same story told another way could injure. And for me this also has meaning because in a way I think I was clearly looking to understand my own identity at first. And in some ways it felt very self-focused. And the more I met others, I realized that my story was far less important. And it was just one story among many stories. And that everybody's story was as interesting as mine and as important as mine. And that in a sense, my whole focus changed from feeling that I can tell my story and the particulars are different for my story from for anyone else's story, but in a sense the particulars are not that important. If the story is a human story, then it resonates with people. And what I started to do was try to figure out how I can get different stories and then what I needed to do with them. Because I was trained as a clinician to work with patients, the Hippocratic Oath was something that was very influenced me. The sense that what you learn from another person, the knowledge that you gain, should not be repeated if they don't want it to be repeated. That it is something that's sacred and secret. So if a deep feeling that a person's story is not what we often say, just a story. It's the person's life. And if the person, we couldn't possibly own a story. So I was stuck with all these stories and I couldn't tell them. So I started, people started talking in the university about the counter story. They said, maybe you can tell a counter story. So the counter story means that, there's this negative story about who those people are. You could tell a counter story about how great those people are. Your parents, I thought, okay, my parents, you know, they met in an office. That's a respectable position that my mother was in. She was an educated woman. She wasn't a lower class woman. I come from a very powerful, honored samurai background. You know, I'm not like those poor kids in Okinawa. I had a good education. You know, I got a doctor's degree. Went to Harvard. I got a good job at Todai. You know, I'm not like those kids at all. This is and I thought, wow, this is a great counter story. And then I realized the counter story was as empty as the story. In other words, it didn't do anything to challenge the whole foundation of the ways in which systems and structures and institutions and organizations create the conditions that lead us to call some people good people and some people bad people, and to say that some women are bad women and some women are good women. That just simply telling this counter story of a successful person doesn't do anything to challenge the whole ways in which we divide and discriminate against some people. So I thought the counter story as a whole is another empty idea, and maybe the only thing, the best I can do is to try to tell as many stories as I can of a wide range of people without trying to make any kind of a statement of who these people are. You know, if I can simply find different people and tell different stories, that maybe it will simply humanize this whole group of people. This is Byron Fija, who's active in Okinawa these days. I've known him for quite a few years, since he was a young guy. But he's somebody who never knew his father, and who looks to everybody, they think he's an American. And he went to LA and he tried to become a rock star. And then he said, I realized I wasn't American. So I might look American to people, but I couldn't speak English. So he came back to Okinawa, and he's wandering through the bar district one night, and he said he heard the sound of the sanshin. So this is the sanshin. And he said it hit him like a bolt of lightning, and he had this transformative experience. And he realized, he said, I realized suddenly who I was when I heard this song. I forget the name of the song, but it was a song about, you know, understanding where you come from. And he said, I realized I'm simply an Okinawan. You know, I might not look like it to anybody, but that's all I am. I grew up with my mother and her family. I never knew who my father was. And that's who I am, and that's who I will express. And so he started to master the sanshin. And then he realized, I'm just like these other young Okinawan kids, and we're singing these songs. We don't really know what we're singing, because they don't know the language anymore. And he said, you know what, wouldn't it be much more amazing thing if I learned the language? And so he found an elderly woman who still knew the language, and he became her student. And he would go to her home 3 times a week, and he did it until he could master the language. And he became the most proficient person in the language at his age. He never went to college, but he's allowed to teach at the universities because he's the only one who can teach the language. He writes a column in the Ryukyu Shinpo, which is a local newspaper there, about the language. And he had a radio show in which he only would speak Okinawan. And he has a partner who would speak in Japanese, just enough to kind of let the listeners understand what he was saying. But they would kind of go back and forth in a very active way. So he's someone who has become a super Okinawan, and he's also developed his, you know, he's able to say to people who would say, you're not Okinawan. Well, can you speak the language? You know, I can. And so he's really empowered himself. As he says, it's like wearing a, what's that word? What do the police wear under their bulletproof vest or something? Bulletproof vest? Armor. It's like wearing armor, that he is protected by the language. And now he started to overcome he used to just play the sanshin at a bar, and eventually somebody would ask him, why is an American like you singing our songs? And so he decided instead he would, and then he would get all confused and didn't know how to respond. But he started to then say, well, at the beginning he introduces himself as somebody who has an Okinawan mother, an American father, and he, Jijo Niyoro, I never knew my father, just by circumstances, and I don't speak English. And then it just releases all the questions. Right? He doesn't have to have any tension that they're going to ask him a question because he's already answered their deepest question. So I started to interview lots of stories. This is somebody some of you might know by name, Norma Field, who became a scholar, wrote the book In the Realm of the Dying Emperor. I grew up in Tokyo. And I also started to look beyond just Japanese stories, getting stories of Chinese. This guy's Peter Kang, a professor at University of Massachusetts. This is Mitzi Hara Carter, who gives a whole different story about what it is to be seen as black in Japan compared to this woman who grew up in post-war Japan. But Mitzi came recently and talks about what is in academics called intersectionality. In other words, how complicated it is to be seen in different perspectives, as an educated black, as an American, as a part of the JET program, therefore in the Japanese, associated with the official Japanese government program. And stories of people. This is a fourth generation Japanese American who came to Japan to find her identity. Other kids in Okinawa who had these are just Ken and Masumi, who had radio program in Okinawa and would use their bilingual abilities in a really dramatic way on the radio show. Interviewing a lot of the mothers who had kids in Okinawa. These are the Fox twins who grew up in Kansai, and like many stories, elementary school went to Japanese school, and then from junior high school went to international school. You see their t-shirt, right? We are all gaijin. And many other stories. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that what became important to me was to publish my work in Japanese. And so I started to write a book in Japanese, and then my editor said, you know, in the sweetest way possible, it'd probably be better if you wrote the book in English, and I'll translate it into Japanese. That'd probably be faster. So that was the end of my Japanese writing career. But I thought I didn't want to do what is often done, is that people do research and they get stories, and then they publish the stories in a language that the people don't even understand or can't read. And so I wanted the stories to be published in Japanese, and they were published in this book by Shueisha Shinsho. And I also published other stories that I was doing, counseling that I was doing with different people in Japanese. And the last thing I did was I got things into the textbooks, where they are now publishing textbooks that are in this particular textbooks, which is used by a lot of junior high schools. They have actually a section on human rights and minorities, and so they put a section about Amerasians in that particular textbook, so that a lot of Japanese kids are now reading about minority issues and human rights issues. And the last thing I'm trying to do also is to do more talking in Japanese contexts, and not just English contexts, sorry. And to try to talk about the different kinds of, the need to expand the borders of the nation, in a sense, to make Japan a more open and inclusive society by, sorry, this is really distracting for you. Let me just forget it. But to try to present more to Japanese audiences about this issue, and not to keep my research in just English circles. So I've been trying to give this week's talks in Japanese as well. So I'm getting very strong signals that I've talked too much, and that often happens with. I often think I'm a very shy person, but any college professor overcomes their shyness suddenly when we get a microphone, and always we talk too much. So this is your chance to talk.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear Stephen talk all night, but unfortunately, we kind of have a hard out at 9 p.m. And so we don't have a lot of time for Q&A. I suppose we only have time for 3 to 5 questions. So if you could please keep your questions brief and to the point, and also please come to the mic and speak on the mic. We're recording this, and you should know that you're implicitly giving your permission to be in the video if you come up and speak on the mic. Okay, so welcome.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. As someone that studies Japanese, but also someone that's mixed race, I connected to a lot of what you said. So I have 2 questions. One is, so I'm from Southern California, and my friends who are half Japanese and half whatever else would refer to themselves as Hapa. But I've also heard hafu, and then I think double in Japanese is becoming more popular. So I'm wondering what the distinctions are between those, and if there's any kind of connotations. I know that hafu is a bit problematic, but I'm wondering about the other ones. And then also, I'm Mexican, but I'm also white, and I had friends who would call me honorary Asian, so when you said honorary black, I thought about that a lot, and I was wondering if you could talk about the psychology of that and the reconciliation between the 2 groups, and kind of if you have anything else you can expand on that, that would be interesting to me. And then also, when people are diminishing maybe your white side because it's not as visible, like you said that most people would just assume that you were Japanese, I was wondering, did you ever feel like you had to somehow prove or emphasize your white side, or how, what kind of emotions or experiences do you have with that? And that's kind of a lot of questions, but thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the first question was about terminology, and when I was younger, I spent a lot of time worrying about terminology, and I did research about it, and looked at the way it went from ainoko to konketsuji. Somebody used the word kokusaiji, and then it went to hafu, and then it went to daburu, and then the strangest thing that happened at NHK a couple years ago was they put a list of, they called sabetsugo, a discriminatory language, and they put hafu on the list, and then it had a recommended term, konketsuji. So I was like, what? Going back in time to, but actually that's something that groups themselves have done, of course, right? To say, so there's a lot of people in the U.S. using the word fat. The word queer was brought back. Black was brought back as a term as well. And so there is a history to that, which, there is a logic in a sense. But what was interesting was that it was never the term tojisha, the people themselves never have made a term, except for hafu. So hafu is the one that is really the most popular among the people themselves who call themselves that. And it's problematic only for those who obsess about the English and know that it has an English origin, which means spelled H-A-L-F, and has an English origin which is usually associated with in a derogatory way, right? You're not complete, you're not whole, you're half. And that's part of the book cover idea too, is that half is whole, when half is whole, meaning that people often see us as half, you're half this or half that, but not as complete. And of course, like the moon, what appears to be half is actually much more than half. In the opposite way, when people say we're full bloods, the full moon, of course, is not full either, right? It's not the whole thing, you're just seeing one side of the full moon. But I guess, and now people are crossing up terms, and so that Hapa, which comes from Hawaii, was seen as a problematic term by some people of taking the Hawaiian language. But my recent research suggests it's not even really Hawaiian. It's more of an English origin as well, even though Hawaiians have claimed, and very few Hawaiians have raised this as an issue. So it's a very few people who have raised Hapa as an issue. And now there's also a blurring of the divisions. There's a thing called Hapa Japan. So we've had 2 conferences in California called Hapa Japan. There's a group. And it's some attempt, I think, to kind of mix the 2 things together, because Hapa is clearly American and it's not a Japanese term. Double is weird, and it's simply something that very few of, well, I'll say us, have ever thought that was a good idea. It was parents. There were parents who were English native speakers usually, and they said, our kids are not half, don't say hafu, that's half. Our kids are more than everybody else. And, I mean, it just sounds stupid in the sense that it's the counter story. Right? It's a counter story in that sense to saying, and that's what comes out of being denigrated. You know, it's a natural reaction. If you've been put down and say you're only half, then it has that sense of empowerment potentially. It's just that it's too, we don't feel comfortable saying it. Most people don't feel comfortable saying "watashi wa double desu." You know, it just feels like it's not natural. And so I think most people I've talked with say that they feel hafu does not equal half. It's a Japanese word, and it has social images and things attached to it, which many of which are positive in people's minds, right? So there is I think generally an acceptance of the word hafu, although some people still don't like it. So like Byron Fija, I showed you, doesn't like the word hafu. And it still is derogatory in the sense that when kids fight, I've heard that what happens often when kids fight is that at the end somebody will say a word that is meant to hurt you. Right? And I've heard it, if the fights will end sometimes like that. Hafu, omae hafu da. Right? Or you know, gaijin, damare, gaijin damare, hafu damare. So it has that tone that it could possibly hurt you because it separates you from other people. And so it isn't a non-problematic term. And there also are books and magazines articles out now about how the whole hafu image is so phony and fake because people think, oh, hafu ii na, kakui na. And it's associated with a whole physical image as if all hafu are so beautiful. You know? And, you know, we're so wonderfully beautiful, and we're all models, you know, and we're all on television. And it's and so people have written books about, you know, the reality is that there are a lot of kids who are being bullied. Right? And it isn't a reality that everybody just admires all the hafu for their beauty. But it's a much more complicated situation in which a lot of hafu kids are bullied at school. You had a lot of questions though, other than that, right? Let me just try to get to one more of your.
Can you talk about honorary?
Oh, honorary. Okay, the honorary. No, I want to talk about another one. You had a different. What was the other one?
How do you reconcile your racial identity that's not visibly recognized by others?
Oh, okay. So you brought up what I think a lot of us do is to overcompensate. I think we're very sensitive about being seen as less than. And so in some ways, in our consciousness, we are acting double, right? So sometimes, so like Byron, you know, with the kimono and all that, is kind of like a way of saying, you know, I'm actually more than you, right? And by his actions, he's saying, I'm more Okinawan than you are. And I think, you know, a lot of us have that, go through stages like that too, of feeling that we want to show because we have to prove it. So like, I always felt that I was being seen as an American when I worked at Todai. And so I always acted super Japanese. And everybody go, ah, maita na, sugoi na. But I knew that as soon as I did something that would be different though, they would go, ah, yappari gaijin da. So it creates a tension though, you know, in you to feel like you constantly have to prove it, and it creates sometimes an overcompensation, I think I would call it. And so I think most people feel a lot better if they can simply be themselves. Right? And in that, for Byron though, it isn't, he's being himself some ways just by being Okinawan. Because he's saying, I'm not bicultural, and some of us are not. There's a whole group in Okinawa they call Shima Hafu. Means that they were raised like he was, with Okinawan mothers, Okinawan family, but they don't know the American side, they don't speak English, they don't know the culture, and so they're being natural by being, he's being natural by being just Okinawan. I wouldn't be natural if I simply acted in a certain way that people identified as Japanese, because I have this whole American side to me and behavior that comes from my father, from living in America, from my English being better than my Japanese, all these reasons, cultural reasons, that if I acted in a way that everybody said, oh, you're Nihonjin da, then I wouldn't be being natural. So if I acted that way, sometimes I would be, but not all the time. So I want to give some other people a chance to ask some questions. You want to, are we passing this one?
They should just come up.
I think this is related to what she was asking, but I'm actually Japanese, and I grew up in the States, and I have a son who's half. And I was just wondering, I don't know about you, but how do you, because I don't really relate to being Japanese or American. So I was wondering, because you're actually, blood-wise half, do you relate to being more American or more, because you were here for a long time, you feel more Japanese? Because I don't feel anything. So that's how I grew up, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And I think my son, interestingly enough, I think he feels more Japanese because he grew up here.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so when I first started doing research, I was very upset by people like you. Because I thought, oh, I'm totally obsessed with this identity stuff. And then I met people like you and I said, it doesn't really matter to me that much. And I thought about my own two sisters, and I talked to them, and they said, Steve, it never really mattered to me very much that, that I was Japanese and American, and I just thought it never mattered. And they never went back to Japan. They never went through all the things that I went through, made it into my whole life focus. And so at first I thought, that's kind of weird, people are like you. And then I realized that's just another way of living, too. My way is probably weird too, in the sense that it was just certain circumstances of, in which I was born, and certain things that happened to me that made me just very self-focused on that part of who I was, and that it became extremely important to me to the extent that I went through all of what I did and turning it into a career in a sense. And the part I didn't mention was I went through whole legal procedures to become Japanese. So in terms of thinking about overcompensating, and I wanted legally to be Japanese, and so then they said if I was born here and I wasn't given citizenship, that's discrimination, and it was simply patrilineal law, which exists in a lot of places in the world. It's not uniquely Japanese at all, and of course it since has changed so that my kids became dual nationals at the time after birth. But I went through I said it's not fair, and so I'm going to get Japanese nationality. So I went through all the legal procedures to get Japanese nationality, and so now I have a koseki, and I put my wife and my children went into my koseki, so I have a Shigematsu koseki now. And so my honmyo, legal name is actually Shigematsu Stephen in katakana, so kanji Shigematsu. So I went through all of that, and I'm kind of like that guy I showed. I said I don't really care anymore about anything, because I think there are for me there were certain times in life when it really mattered, and the whole story I think of the book too and the research is that it started out as this very exclusive thing about mixed race. And like when I was in graduate school and graduate students would talk about, what are you researching? And I'd say, I'm doing mixed race identity, and they go, oh yeah. And they, of course, because that's your big problem about your identity. And you're the only one that would care about it, But, and so it was seen as like this kind of strange thing that I was doing. And at that time it wasn't, since then of course mixed race studies have taken off in the United States, but at that time it was a strange topic. But it was something that I ended up pursuing for quite a long time, and ended up feeling that what I had once thought of and started as something that separated me from others, maybe connected me with a few other people who are also just like me, now I feel like it's something that really connects me with others. In other words, I've used that book, When Half is Whole, in teaching psychology classes, anthropology class. Even I taught a class at Stanford, human biology, and I used that book. And always get reactions. We can see this is a book about human development. It's a book that anybody can relate to, because it's the particulars are focusing on mixed race, but I started to see it simply as a metaphor. So like the mixedness is very obvious, right, in certain people, but inside of almost everybody is the same kind of dilemmas that are expressed in the title and in the image of the half moon. So the idea that we're born whole, but that gradually we suffer from experiences that we have in life start to fragment us. We start to separate from parts of ourselves that become in the darkness. People tell us who we are and who we are not. Right? This is who you are and this is who you are not. This is who you can be, or you can't be this because you are a girl. You can't be this because you're black. You can't be this because of some reason. This is who you must be. And so, like that moon image, I think parts of us start to become traumatized or disconnected from ourselves. And that healing and wholeness and the storytelling process to me is one in which we start to get more connected to these parts of us that have been pushed into the darkness. And we start to then become fuller and connect more with others. And so to me, the stories that I've been told, that even though the particulars are about mixed race, that they're stories about healing and wholeness, and they are something that anybody can relate to, because all human beings and human development are fragmented in the same way and are always trying to move more towards wholeness. That make sense? Can you use that one?
Well, I'll make it very quick.
Okay.
There was an institution called the Elizabeth Sanders Home.
Yeah.
And did you try to interview people who went through that school, or that institution still exists in Oiso?
Quick answer: no. But I knew other people who were doing that, so that was I purposely didn't. But there are amazing stories from there as well. There were those who were residents, but also there were some kids who commuted. So there were kids who had this amazing, of course they were sent there originally to protect them from society, right? And thought they needed to be protected. And then she actually had a very strong conflict with a guy named Hirano, who had a very different opinion that she wanted to actually take kids to Brazil, thinking that Japanese are never going to accept these kids and we've got to get them out of this country. Hirano had a very different feeling. He himself was mixed, and he felt, I fought through it, and I'm going to help these other kids to fight through this too. He personally legally adopted over 20 kids, and he had a whole informal support network for these kids. But he believed that Japanese society has to be changed by people fighting against that. And so the two of them had a falling out in some ways anyway, so a long story about that, but I personally did not interview any.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm also half Japanese, and I was struck by when you started talking about Okinawa, and I think it became very clear that the personal is political. And I wondered, during your research within Japan as well as cross-cultural research, thank you, sorry, I'm very short, whether you came up with any policy recommendations on what Japan can do to become more progressive in that sense, in addressing or at least acknowledging ethnic minorities and I guess it's more diverse identity today.
No, the government has never asked me for my opinions, but when I went to Okinawa, there was a new school formed called the Amerasian School in 1999. At that time, I went to Okinawa with Tanaka Hiroshi, who was a very well-known activist for Zainichi Korean causes, and we went to support the school. And so I was interviewed at that time by the local media, and I gave an ambivalent support to the school because I said I think the school is a very great place, a safe haven for those kids who are being strongly bullied and feel that they need to be separated from into their own school. But for the vast majority of kids who are being sometimes mildly bullied, but who say, I'd rather go to my neighborhood school than I want to this other school and be isolated. I'd rather go to school with my friends in the neighborhood. I think the Japanese government was too willing to separate. So they started to support this separate education. And I said, instead of supporting separation and segregation, segregated schools, you need to put more effort into bilingual education, or what in the US, multicultural education. You have to educate the teachers to know how to integrate and support these kids who are different in any kind of way. And you need to make it, so you need to make a more inclusive public school rather than to say, let's support these schools that are separated from. So I wanted the government to take more responsibility for what in the US is called bilingual and multicultural education. So in that sense, I did have some policy recommendation, but I don't think it was listened to.
Do you see language as a primary variable in assimilation to a culture?
Do I see language as I see language as extremely important, yeah. So over the years, I've had many people come from visiting from other countries who are mixed Japanese, and some of you may have seen there's a film, Hapa, and it shows one of these girls coming from Australia and coming to Japan, and she's going to find herself and her identity, and then 7 months later, she's leaving Japan and making the statement, well, it doesn't matter how long you stay in Japan, you can never be accepted as Japanese. And I thought I got so tired of hearing that, because it's so unfair, for somebody to come here and they don't speak Japanese, and they don't even, she's leaving up and she still can barely say anything except for konnichiwa, and here she's making a statement, and she's only stayed 7 months. She's only tried for 7 months. You say, no matter how long you stay in Japan, you can never be accepted as Japanese. And I just feel it's totally unfair to Japanese society to have that expectation that just because you're genetically part Japanese, that you can come here and be seen as Japanese. But I think you can much more if you speak the language. Right? It's the same probably in any country, that if you speak the language, people open up to you more. And they say, oh, you might look different, but you speak our language, and there's a great intimacy that is in a connection that's created by that shared language. So I always would like people who come here who have Japanese ancestry to put effort into it and to put time in, to give it time. And I gave it 15 years. And in the end, I discovered, working at Todai for 15 years, that to many people, I was simply one of their fellow workers. You go to the same place every day, you work with the same people. And there were moments when the gaijin kind of thing came out, but on a daily level, I just felt like we were the same. They had accepted me as a fellow worker. That was more important than the difference of being racially different.
Stephen, I wanted to ask, as a person, as a scholar who's been dealing with issues related to multi-ethnicity and mixed identities for many years, what your take is on the recent controversies with Rachel Dolezal. This is the NCAA former leader of Spokane who self-identified as being black, but kind of defies these racial categories. And kind of as a comparable case in some ways, Bruce or Caitlyn Jenner, who's also transgendering and mixing identities and complicating those categories. Do you think that the world is changing in the sense that the center no longer holds, and that people are accepting these complex identities in ways that maybe they didn't previously, and that maybe we're kind of dealing with something of an antiquated discourse? In my courses, I've realized that students are kind of way ahead of me, because their lived experience now is very different than where I was at their age, some years ago.
Yeah, I have a course I teach at Stanford I call Transforming Self and Systems, and sometimes Crossing Borders of Race, Sex, and Nation. And it's really been a great education for me to see all these students who are in these border crossing positions in ways that are far beyond my understanding and experience. And I think we're at a place where these borders are being crossed in ways that have never been done before, and I think communities are finding that they have to be more open to that. Like the Japanese American community in the States is the oldest Asian American community, and it's at a place now where most of the younger generation, a majority are mixed ancestry. And you also have, you go to like my local Buddhist temple, most of the families are mixed. So you have people who are not genetically Japanese who want to be part of this community. And so it also brings up that issue. There was a guy for the New Orleans Saints, which is a American football team. Scott Fujita was his name. And he said, I identify as Japanese American. He appears to be a white American. And he says, yes, genetically I am, but I was adopted by a Japanese American couple, and I was raised by them, and so I grew up with Japanese American culture. And so I just feel like I'm Japanese. And there are more people like that who I think are really challenging our strict divisions, that we've constructed based on some things that we could, and sometimes are very hard to define and to justify what that border is. And sometimes the borders are clearer, but I think that we're all pushed to really be more open to the different possibilities that people could be included in ways that, based on their choice, and that they have reasons to be included that we might before have said, well, that's not good enough. That's not good enough to say that you can belong to this community. I think a lot of people might have accepted Rachel Dolezal if she had been honest. But it simply was a fabrication that, and the dishonesty, I think that's upsetting a lot of people now. But there are some who are coming forward and saying that if she had presented herself and said, I identify as black, but I am genetically white or biologically white, but I identify as black, and then people respected the work she did and said, why not? If you're dedicated to this community, you work for this community, and you want to say I identify as black, we're okay with that, but just be honest too, and be upfront, and you're not black, and you're not black in that way. You might identify as black, but don't lie about the fact that you don't have this other biology as black. But in general, I think that I feel challenged as you do to keep up with the changes and the possibilities of border crossing, which I think is all in the end beneficial because it leads to inclusion. We can be more inclusive of people who want to be part of a group or a community.
Stephen, thank you very much. As always, very, very interesting and thought-provoking and very moving. I wish Stephen was still teaching at TUJ. So you have an open audience here, opportunity anytime you visit. I'd like to encourage you to buy this book. It's only 3,000 yen. And Stephen, do you have any upcoming lectures, projects, or things? I mean, you have a good website that we could point people to.
I'm taking a little different track. I'm coming out with a book in Japanese by Kodansha called, it's probably going to be called Stanford no Mindful Kyoshitsu. So I'm getting into this mindful thing because it's really hot, So, and actually my class, I started a program at Stanford called Mindful Education.
Yeah.
And I teach different subjects, but based in a mindfulness approach.
I'm sure you're the embodiment of mindfulness. So everyone, if you could leave your meishi with us, we'd be happy to put you on a mailing list. We have events sometimes 2-3 times a week. I think we do as many as 40 of these events a year. We are a nonprofit organization, but we do incur some expenses, and we have a donation box here. If you're feeling generous after you spend 3,000 yen on this book. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and again, thank you so much to Stephen.
So there's, on Sunday there's a Hafu event. So if anybody's interested in seeing what a Hafu community is like, there's an event on Sunday in which there are going to be films, including the Hafu film, and then some newer films that have been made by. And then I'm going to give do something in the evening.
Where is that?
It's in Otsuka. So if you're into Facebook, you can friend me on Facebook and I'll send you the information that way.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you.